welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a totally fascinating and honestly pretty intense chapter in political theory. We're going to unpack how materialist thinkers believed capitalism actually evolves into extreme systems during times of crisis. And we'll also explore the massive academic pushback against those very ideas. So buckle up because it's a deep dive into the historical frameworks that tried to make sense of a really turbulent 20th century. Let's kick things off with a pretty big question. When an economic system hits a massive crisis, what actually happens to it? Does it just fold up and collapse? Or does it adapt, mutate, and take on entirely new, maybe even more extreme forms just to survive? This question right here is really the beating heart of the whole materialist critique. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with capitalism in transition, then look at Lenin's 5 pillars, move on to fascism as bourgeois rule, and finally wrap up with criticism and contradictions. Okay, Section 1, Capitalism in Transition. The really crucial thing to grasp here is that materialist thinkers, people like W.I. Lenin, and later on Reinhard Kuhnel, they absolutely did not see things like imperialism or fascism as just random historical accidents. Not at all. They theorized them as systemic solutions. Their argument was that when bourgeois society faces severe threats, it inherently evolves into new, extreme stages to protect its wealth and power structures. It mutates to survive.
Moving right along to Section 2, Lenin's 5 pillars.
So, let's set the scene. It's just before the outbreak of the First World War. Lenin is deep in a massive research phase in Switzerland in 1915, reading literally hundreds of texts. He writes his manuscript in Zurich the following year, heavily building on earlier works by John A. Hobson and Rudolf Hilferding. And finally, he publishes it in Petrograd in 1917, really seeking to explain the global capitalist economy that he firmly believed had dragged the world into war.
Right at the core of Lenin's whole thesis is this idea of finance capital. He basically argued that old-school capitalism, the kind with free market competition, was completely dead. It had been replaced by a system where a tiny handful of monopolistic banks fused together with industrial capital. To Lenin, this created a super powerful financial oligarchy that dictated the entire economy, totally bypassing the free market.
Lenin actually distilled his definition of imperialism, which he considered the absolute highest and final stage of capitalism, into 5 very specific pillars. He argued that 1. Production concentrated into monopolies. 2. Finance capital rose to total dominance. 3. The export of capital actually became way more important than the export of physical goods. 4. International cartels formed to carve up the global market. And 5. The entire territorial surface of the Earth was completely divided up among the major capitalist powers.
Now, there's a super fascinating shift that happens in Lenin's theory here. Think about old capitalism. Nations exported manufactured goods, right? But under this new imperialism, Lenin argued that mature capitalist nations essentially ran out of profitable domestic investments. They had nowhere left to grow at home. So, to survive, they were literally forced to export raw capital to less developed countries.
But Lenin saw a massive, fatal flaw in all of this. He argued, and I quote, "Every monopoly inevitably engenders a tendency to stagnation and decay." Basically, his point was that without competition, the drive to innovate just vanishes. Lenin posited that imperialist nations turn into what he called a Rentnerstaat, or rentier state. The elite become totally disconnected from actual production. They just live in idleness, literally clipping coupons from their global financial investments. And this global exploitation? Well, Lenin claimed it had a massive impact back home too. He coined this term the labor aristocracy. Essentially, he's talking about a segment of the domestic working class that was bribed by the imperialist state. By sharing just a tiny slice of the massive monopoly profits they extracted from colonies, the bourgeoisie could buy the loyalty of domestic labor leaders. He argued this bribery led to opportunism and social chauvinism within the labor movement, which destroyed international worker solidarity and made imperialist wars a whole lot more likely.
All right, that brings us to Section 3, Fascism as bourgeois rule.
Fast forward a few decades, and we turn to Reinhard Kuhnel. He was a prominent German political scientist of the Marburg School. Growing up in the Sudetenland, Kuhnel actually experienced the extreme brutality of fascist rule firsthand, which profoundly shaped his academic focus. In the 1970s, he became widely known for his highly debated interpretations of exactly how and why fascist regimes take power, looking at the extreme domestic forms of capitalism.
Colonel championed a theory known as functionalism. So instead of looking at fascism as just some inexplicable historical glitch or merely the product of evil individuals, Kern's theory suggests that fascist regimes actually serve a very specific, objective function. When the bourgeois capitalist social order is severely threatened, say by a massive economic crisis or a rising labor movement, his theory argues that fascism is utilized to violently maintain that capitalist system. It's honestly a pretty chilling perspective when you think about it. It frames extreme political violence and totalitarianism as a calculated systemic economic defense mechanism, rather than just sheer ideological madness. In this view, the capitalist elites enable fascism because it does things like crush unions and secure property rights during times of severe crisis. In his highly debated 1971 book, Kuhl did something incredibly controversial. He juxtaposed liberalism and fascism. He basically argued that they are merely two different forms of the exact same thing, bourgeois rule. One uses democratic representation during stable times, and the other uses violent suppression during unstable times. Naturally, drawing a direct equivalence like that drew incredibly sharp criticism for blurring the vast, qualitative differences between a democracy and a dictatorship. Which brings us to our final part, Section 4, Criticism and Contradictions. So, where does the academic pushback actually begin? Well, it's pretty intense. First, let's look at Lenin's idea of the labor aristocracy. Marxist theorist Fritz Sternberg noted that real wages for the working class rose broadly across the board. It wasn't just a narrowly bribed leadership class. Furthermore, political scientist Aaron Fetcher points out that World War II alliances completely contradict Lenin's theories of imperialist rivalry. I mean, the fact that the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union allied together against fascist powers, that just doesn't fit neatly into the materialist model of wars being strictly capitalist-driven conflicts for capital export. And it doesn't stop there. Political scientist Hartmut Elsenhans argues that the entire economic foundation of Lenin's theory kind of just collapses. Why? Because it relies on the Marxist falling rate of profit law, a law that Elsenhans argues simply cannot be empirically proven. And without that falling rate, the whole desperate need to export capital just disappears. Adding to this, historian Gerd Koenen highlights massive chronological gaps. Lenin dated the start of modern imperialism to the year 1900, but historical records clearly show that the peak of imperialist colonial expansion actually happened decades before that. Koenen goes even further, highlighting these massive logical gaps between Lenin's theory and actual historical reality. Lenin's theory insists that imperialist powers export capital and fight wars in the colonies to secure those markets. Yet reality shows that Imperial Russia was actually a massive capital importer, not an exporter. Moreover, natural imperialist rivals like Britain and France actually allied together, and the massive devastation of the First World War was primarily fought right there on the continent of Europe, not out in the colonial periphery. Ultimately, esteemed historians like Wolfgang J. Mommsen look at Lenin's work and say, look, this isn't hard objective economic science. It's a political polemic. Mommsen argues it was written primarily to attack Lenin's rivals in the Social Democratic Party, and crucially to excuse why the predicted Marxist revolution had utterly failed to materialize in advanced capitalist states. The theory provided a really convenient scapegoat, this bribed labor aristocracy, for the lack of revolutionary zeal among Western workers. Now, the pushback against Reinhard Kuhnel's ideas is equally fierce. Critics maintain that reducing fascism to just another flavor of bourgeois rule is, well, it's not just historically inaccurate, it's actually dangerous. By flattening the distinction between a flawed liberal democracy and a murderous totalitarian fascist dictatorship, critics argue that Kuhnel's functionalist approach completely ignores the unique, catastrophic reality, the sheer ideological terror, and the immense human cost of fascist ideologies. It reduces all of that horror to a mere mechanical defense of property rights. Okay, let's tie this all together. What have we actually learned today in this explainer? We've seen that materialist theorists provide a very specific lens, viewing capitalism as a system constantly evolving through crisis. Lenin framed imperialism as the global manifestation of monopoly capitalism, while Kuhn's framed fascism as its violent domestic self-defense mechanism. However, as we've just seen, while these theories offer a tightly woven, compelling narrative, historians reveal massive empirical contradictions when these ideas actually crash against the complex rocks of historical reality. Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question to ponder as we close out today's explainer. Are these materialist theories basically just historical artifacts of the 20th century, heavily colored by the political agendas of their authors? Or, despite their pretty obvious flaws,
Do they still offer us a useful lens to understand the wealth concentration, global conflicts, and economic crises of our modern world today? Thank you so much for joining me as we explored this topic. Keep questioning and keep learning.